So within this recording, really, which is just a very, very simple introductory recording, we're going to look at the kind of the notion of the preparation and an introduction to the training methods. Training methods, which of course we should have there with a capital M. So let's put our little capital M in there for us. So what do we have here? Well, first of all, I just want to introduce you to the types of training that we have. So I'm just going to mention a couple of types to you. We're not going to do a lot with these at this point, just to introduce you to the idea. The first group of types of training I want you to be aware of is what we call the intermittent group, the intermittent. And if you haven't come across the word intermittent, it simply means that it starts and it stops. We've got the intermittent group. So everything I'm going to kind of put in this aqua color is involved in that. First of all, we have the notion, which you probably will have guessed, of interval training. We train, we have a repetition and we stop and rest. We have a repetition and we stop and rest. Therefore, interval is clearly an intermittent exercise. But can you consider also that so is resistance training, or what we might want to more loosely call weight training. So resistance and weight is also by its nature intermittent. And finally, so is circuit training. So these methods here are all forms of intermittent training. That's meant to be an arrowhead there. These are all forms of intermittent training. And I think that's a really interesting point. How many times have we considered resistance training as a form of intermittent training, very closely related to interval training? We train, we rest. We train, we rest. Now, we also have other groupings. The next one I want you to have an awareness of is this little grouping here, as I just move my tablet slightly. So we have this grouping here. We have the idea of mobility. We have the idea of plyometrics. And we have the idea of SAQ training. SAQ stands for speed, agility, and quickness training. And the point I'd really like you guys to kind of have clear in your mind is that these three methodologies, although they're not directly related, they all have very strong interconnection with the neuromuscular system. So the neural control of movement, and especially what we might call autonomic stretch reflexes, are very important within these. So therefore we kind of group them together. More of that and the detail of that later when we get into the specific training method. And finally, we have two types of training which we're going to loosely refer to as continuous. The first one is itself continuous training. You know, many people often think about going for a jog in this context, a minimum of 20 minutes steady state submaximal exercise. But we also want to consider that we include fartlek as a continuous training method, okay, as a continuous training method. So we've got those three groupings, and it's very useful for us just to have an awareness. Of course, each of those we're going to go into a lot more detail later on. Now, the other thing I want to get across to you now is I want to address with you some of the principles. Now, let me be clear. I'm not talking here about the principles of training. I'm talking about the principles by which we just simply consider training methodologies and some of the overriding principles that are useful for you to remember. First of all, it's ever such an obvious point. The objective of physical training is to increase fitness. Now, obviously, that is a fairly clear and obvious statement to make, but we are making it. We're not talking about training in this sense for kind of health promotion or to make you happier. It is specifically looking at increasing fitness. We're not considering here the social side of training, just the fitness development. Secondly, we do, and this is one of our principles of training, we do apply the FIT principle of frequency, intensity, and time to make sure that our training is appropriate to the people that we're working with, indeed to ourselves if we're the athlete. Other points I'd make is that because we're applying the principle of FIT, we're also looking to produce adaptations. Now, adaptations are long-term physiological changes to the body that are caused by the application of this FIT, or what we might call the principle of overload. So we are specifically looking to cause our body to adapt. Other quick points. I also want you to think that one of the key facets of thinking about a training method is that we must avoid injury. Okay, so we're looking to do this in a way that is as safe as possible and is as least likely as possible to cause physical damage. We are also looking to apply our training in a model where we avoid overuse. More of injuries later on in this course, but we're looking to avoid overuse. So of course, if we always do running-based continuous training, it's quite likely that we're going to experience kind of overuse injuries of the legs, things like stress fractures, for example. So we need to be more mixed in our approach. And finally, when we look to apply training methods, we are looking as well to avoid burnout. And what we mean by avoiding burnout is that we don't apply so much training all in one go, increasing to the point that psychologically we become kind of exhausted. So we're looking to apply these principles. And why altogether? Well, we're looking to improve performance. Okay, so we're looking to improve performance. Now, of course, we are specifically going to look at the principles of training later on, but these principles are also going to be useful for you to consider, because by applying these to any possibility of ongoing training, we're far more likely to make that training effective.